Thank you everyone for coming. This class is going to be impact versus intent with the Honorable Lady Sabine, who is the DEI officer of Artemisia. So I'm super excited. I've taken it. It's a really good class. And she is going to go ahead and talk a little bit about herself and get started. And then if you have any questions, she'll be pausing during the class and we will facilitate you guys getting the answers you need. Okay. So Sabine, go ahead and take over.
Awesome. Thanks, Zara. Hi, I'm Sabine. I am the Artemisian DEI officer currently, and mundanely, I am also a therapist. And so there's a lot of silence at the beginning as we were waiting for everything. And I was like, yeah, this is my daily job. I'm comfortable with this silence. So impact versus intent comes up a lot in my work, and I think it's come up quite a bit in the SCA as well. You know, it just comes up sort of in our daily lives with conflict resolution and things like that. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about the nuances of each, kind of the pros and the cons of understanding it, and sort of different examples of how it fits within the SCA, how it fits within the DEI office. And we'll kind of have a few breaks for questions or thoughts or anything like that as well. So we will get started here. I've got a PowerPoint, so I will be sharing my screen most of the time. But then when we break for questions, I might unshare so we can kind of all see each other and things like that. So if you have questions, feel free to type them in the chat. Zara will be manning that, and then also feel free, because this is live on Facebook, feel free to type in anything on Facebook, and Katie will take over that as well. So without further ado, I will just share my screen and we can get started with this. Here we go. All right, and let's actually play the slides. Cool. So intent versus impact. And the reason I kind of like this is because sometimes our words have almost like this explosive impact that maybe we don't recognize. And so I really liked this intro to this class. So what's the big deal with understanding intent versus impact? Is it the thought that counts, or does the outcome matter more? So let's talk about each one. So intent is the purpose or the reason that you are attempting to communicate a message. And it infers the kind of person someone is based on what is inherently behind their message. You know, so an example of this would be their intent is to provide a compliment, right? That usually is what happens. And then sometimes the impact might be different. So the impact is the result or the outcome of an action. Now, it's really important with understanding impact is that it separates person from behavior, and it allows the impacted to be acknowledged as much as, if not more than, the speaker. Usually this conversation occurs when a miscommunication or perceived harm has occurred, and we tend to agree that impact is equally important to intent until we learn that our intent had a hurtful impact. Then we're like, oh no, we didn't mean it, you know? So it's important to kind of understand both and recognize the importance of both. The current train of thought that I think a lot of society employs and has employed is that there's more focus on protecting the intent or the character of individuals rather than the impact experienced by the receiver. Most of us, we don't have malicious intentions. And it's uncomfortable for us to learn when we hurt someone. You know, it's absolutely uncomfortable. And we're human and we make mistakes. And I think from a grounded place, from a logical place, we kind of recognize that, like when we're separated from what we've done. And then in the moment, it can be really hard to recognize, like, I've impacted someone. I need to recognize that. I need to take accountability and ownership of that. The problem with intent being more important than impact is that it creates a victim blaming situation. You know, so common statements that we hear often is, I didn't mean it that way. or they're just being too sensitive. And that can be putting the responsibility back on the impacted. And that's where it can get a little bit even more conflicted in the relationship. So I like this picture down at the bottom, because I had a real life experience where I did this as a teenager. Ran over the foot of some person unintentionally. I was just messing around in their car. They were standing outside of it, ran over their foot. I felt horrible. It wasn't my intention to run over their foot. And at the same time, the impact was that it broke their foot, right? And so it's important to recognize that like, our intentions can be very different than the impact that they have. And if we ignore the impact, then we're ignoring something very important. So let's understand the pros and the cons of understanding intent, right? So when we understand the intent of others or ourselves, it allows for grace and the benefit of the doubt, which I think is super important. It also demonstrates when we are aware of our intent or someone else is aware of their intent, it demonstrates that self-awareness. And knowing that, and saying that, well, I didn't mean it that way, it can provide some self-protection, right? Because we don't want to be in that cognitive dissonance of, I'm not a bad person, right? The intent could be to connect and build relationships. And I put that there because usually that's what's happening. And it's just a miscommunication happen, miswires. And so the intent is to build and connect relationships. And at the same time, it might hurt those relationships. And so understanding that maybe the intent is there can help. And psychologically, there's research that's been done that shows that when those people who have been impacted know that the intent was not harmful, it actually benefits the impacted to know, oh, they didn't have harmful intent. So it is important to understand intent, because as the impacted, you will feel a little bit better. And if you just think about that in a situation where you've been impacted, if someone did it maliciously, you might feel worse. I know I would. I would definitely feel worse if I knew that they were intentionally out to get me versus they had no idea, right? Or they meant well and it just didn't go well, right? The cons is that it demonstrates privilege when the conversation stops here. If we are only trying to understand intent, that's absolutely a place of privilege. Understanding intent and not understanding impact deflects criticism about oppressive language. And this is really important to understand, because we may be using language that we don't realize is oppressive or offensive. And if we're only focused on our intent, like, well, I'm not a racist, even though you're saying maybe a racist thing, then that demonstrates that privilege. It implies that the speaker's identity and message matters more than the effect that happened to the impacted. And that message is crucial in recognizing, because I don't think we would want to think that we're more important or less important than anybody else, and recognizing that if we only stop at intent, we are communicating that message. And just like we talked about before with that psychological impact, the intentional aggressions get linked with higher levels of suffering. And when someone experiences a pretty big impact, we tend to immediately want to assume malicious intent, even though that may not occur. So it's really important to understand whether or not malicious intent is there, because if a person is suffering quite a bit, then they might immediately assume malicious intent. And so we want to make sure that we don't do that, that we try to keep open even if we are affected, right? So understanding impact, some of the pros. When we understand how we've hurt someone, it validates their feelings and it creates a healing space in the relationship. It continues to increase self-awareness that, oh, wow, I said this thing and it hurt somebody. want to make sure I don't say that again, or at least not to them. It allows for repair in relationships and allows for correction and learning opportunities. And it demonstrates accountability, which is just one of those like fundamental things in relationships. If we keep blaming each other or throwing it back at one another, it's not really going to be a productive relationship. And so accountability helps with that productivity in relationships. The cons with understanding impact is that it can trigger a defensive response in the speaker. And we tend to see this a lot when we communicate how something has impacted us. Other people can tend to respond defensively. Understanding the impact that we've had on somebody can tap into our own shame and project the wrongdoing onto the receiver. So we have to be very aware of what's coming up with us when we learn that we've impacted somebody in a negative way. Internal filters, we all have them. We all filter the world through our own biases, through our, and unconscious biases, but through our own experiences, through even our genetics, right? And so we have to recognize what filters we have that might play a role. What kinds of core beliefs do we have about ourselves or the world that might be playing a role in this, and understanding how to challenge some of those filters if needed. And then, understanding how we've had an impact on somebody could lead to feeling potentially feel misunderstood and stupid, right? Like recognizing what's coming up in us could be really, really difficult, and it's really easy to just put it on the other person. So I'm going to take a pause here and stop for any questions that might be coming up.
Okay, we do have one question from Cassandra that says, is it okay to say, I apologize, that was not my intent?
It's a great question. We're going to kind of go into that in a little bit about like how to handle these situations, but it's a great question in that we can absolutely say we're sorry, hey, sorry, that wasn't my intent, because we found that when they know our intent, it can actually help reduce suffering. And we have to follow that up with some sort of corrective, right? Like, I'm sorry, that wasn't my intent. How can I do better? And you don't have to put that back on them, but like, I'd like to do better. If you can help me with that, I would really appreciate it, right? And so it's one of those things where recognizing kind of, and it depends on the severity of it, right? Because some people may be like, that was offensive, but whatever, dirt off my shoulder, whatever. And some people may be really impacted. And so if they're like, that was offensive, but no big deal, you can say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, right? Versus if somebody is very impacted, and then it can look like, I'm really sorry, I want to do better. And gauging that sort of response and matching the response to the hurt that has occurred.
And then we do have one comment. It says from Kathy, I taught my children there's a difference between implied meaning and inferred meaning. And then if anyone else wants to chime in, please do raise your hand using the Zoom feature, or just drop a quick note in the chat and I will call on you.
And actually, I kind of want to go back to that comment, and if the person who wrote it, if they feel comfortable saying more about that, I'd love to hear more of that.
Hi, that was me.
Hi.
Hi. So I've always taught my kids that there's a difference between what you think you say and what somebody else hears you say. And there is and that can be contributed to by the tone of your language and how you present that. So it's kind of ironic that my 9-year-old granddaughter hears from her father, it's your tone and what you implied that I'm hearing, right? So I've driven it into him. But the reality of it is we say stuff that is insensitive to someone else because of the experiences they've had. And, there's sometimes 3 sides to every story. There's yours, there's mine, and there's the truth. Because in the middle are those things that our emotions do not affect. So, I think a lot of times it is that what people hear you say, but some of it is their emotional response to what you what you said. So there's kind of that middle ground where I hope that we can help people say, that's not what I meant. I was unaware that made you feel that way. And I need to check that in my system. It's kind of like the, you know what I mean? Unconscious bias concept. But yeah, so I've always taught my kids implied and inferred are two very different things.
That's fantastic. Thank you for commenting with that, because that blended in beautifully.
And then Cassandra did follow up with, I've had many conversations over the years about intentions versus perceptions. In many ways, this reminds me of TQM training I had back in the 90s. And I actually would love to have you talk a little bit more. So where do you think tone fits into the intent versus impact discussion, since we brought up the idea? Because I know tone policing is something that gets tossed around a lot as a term, but I don't know how that interacts with a conversation like this one.
I think it does interact, because we can communicate. So there's a lot of layers to this, right? Because we can communicate the same message with so many different tones, and then that communicates so many different messages. The hard part, I would say, is that there are sometimes we don't recognize our own tone, right? We don't recognize the way that we are coming off and the way that we are landing on people. And that's why it's really important to be able to have this open dialogue and be able to be open to it, being like, hey, that tone landed on me like you were angry. Are you upset right now? Like, is that what's going on? And just kind of checking and clarifying things, because one, sometimes people may just be having a bad day, right? Like, that could be it too. And so having them check that, be like, oh man, I didn't mean to come across that way. It's just been a bad day, that kind of thing. Because yeah, I'm just like thinking, I'm trying to think of like a very innocuous sentence. Like, I work with teenagers. And so it's like, did you make your bed versus did you make your bed? Like very subtle tone differences can communicate a lot. I don't know if there's any other examples that people can think about with tone, but I think that was a great question.
So I do have one comment. So one of the things that I've been thinking about is, because of everything that's happened with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also kind of like following on with the bullying kind of concept, I think there's times whenever we refer to people as old school, which is derogatory to them, and it's short-sighted for us that, we're categorizing them. So, I mean, that's one phrase I'm going to try to get rid of, right? Because it could be bad. And it could be, making a diversity there that should not exist, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. How else, just because it does make sense to me, how else would you categorize that then? What would you describe that as?
Well, I'm not sure, and that's part of the reason I'm bringing it up, because when you talk about people who are old school, you have a lot of implied, meaning there, meaning that they can't change, they won't change, they don't think the way that you do maybe, or way that the current character of the organization does. So, I mean, I guess in my mind, we should probably stop using that kind of thing, because the old boys club and old school, they have a meaning that can be tied to a lot of bias issues. So I just think that maybe that's what I need to do, because I don't want to create I don't want to misspeak in any situation, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. And I think that will bleed really well into, we talk about, sort of unconscious bias later on in this presentation. And so looking at different things like that communicate a bias towards a certain group of people unintentionally. Yeah.
Okay, we did have a couple more comments, so I'll just go ahead and read those out. So Cassandra followed up with, I think electronic communication has so many challenges because it is solely based on the perception of the receiver what the tone of the speaker is.
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth said, as an interpreter, I took an entire semester long class on interpreting intonation. It can be so subtle or extremely obvious depending on the person and the way they present things. And then Annette said, as a person with a naturally sharp toned voice, I have had no end of trouble with tone of voice. And Juniper said, I use the phrase old school a lot, but in my opinion, that doesn't mean unwilling to change.
Great comments. Yeah, I especially look back at that technology one, and it's like, I'm kind of glad that we, you know, like emojis are a thing now, because that helps us convey a little bit of a different tone with certain things. Because yeah, that form of communication can be really difficult, and leave a very different impact than intent. And I think my hope for this class is less about, you know, you're not doing this, that kind of thing, but more as a way for us to help better understand ourselves and build more self-awareness, and self-inquiry, right? Like, is this how I'm coming off, right? Because if we just keep pointing the finger at somebody else, expecting them to change, I think we're just going to keep running uphill and it may not go very far. All right. Well, I don't know, Katie, if there's anything on Facebook that's coming up on your end.
It is rather quiet at the moment. I did post for people to let me know so they're aware that they can offer questions. So I will definitely speak up, but right now you just have people observing.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, and welcome to everybody in Facebook land. All right, so I'll go back to sharing my screen here. I'll talk about the next little section. There we go. So important considerations when looking at intent versus impact. We're going to make mistakes. And I think we realize this now when we're logical and we're grounded. And it's important to keep this in mind when we're more emotional, when we realize we've hurt somebody, or when we are hurt ourselves. We're human. We all make mistakes. We need to, and it's important to separate behavior from personhood. We want actions to be called into question, not character, because that makes a far more productive conversation than saying, oh, they're just a racist, versus that statement was made in it sounded very racist, right? Because then you can focus on the statement rather than the character, because things can really like unravel when you focus on character. The impact of our words and actions are far more powerful than we give them credit for. And as we talked about before, higher levels of suffering make us want to assign more harmful intent. And it's really important for us to recognize that tendency within ourselves and check it, because even if we're impacted, that may not have been their intent. Just because we didn't mean to do anything wrong also doesn't mean we didn't do anything wrong. So going back to the person with the intent, just because we didn't have wrongful intent doesn't mean we didn't hurt anybody. And it's not the job of the impacted to be able to mind read intent. And so it's important to have this conversation on both sides. Communicate your intent and communicate the way that it impacted you. So let's talk about DEI related concepts. So privilege, we've talked about this a little bit. There is inherent privilege when the conversation stops at intent and does not acknowledge impact. Talked about that quite a bit. These next three kind of pieces are part of Zara's DEI 101 class, which is fantastic. If you haven't taken it yet, please take it. You'll unpack a lot more of these concepts in that class, and they bleed very well. They mesh very well. I don't know why I keep using bleed, like it's a very weird term, but they mesh very well with this class. And so we have to check our own privilege, especially when it comes to, you know, if there, I keep using the race thing a lot because it's very relevant right now, right? But if there is white privilege coming across in terms of this intent versus impact thing, it's very important to look at that. as well as, we've talked about this a little bit already, unconscious bias. Sometimes our biases play out and they get called out with our intent versus our impact. Having a bias doesn't mean that you're a bad person. We all have biases, and they're mental shortcuts, which can be harmful if unchecked. You know, they can be stereotypical, they can be things like that. They can hurt other people's feelings. So all of these fit within DEI related concepts that we want to discuss. Then microaggressions. So the microaggression, if you haven't taken the DEI 101 class, it's a slight that demeans, marginalizes, stereotypes, or denigrates a person. You know, an aggressive action is, you know, being up in their face, punching them, whatever. Microaggression is saying something that demeans somebody's identity and their integrity. And so these are all comments from the DEI 101 class, which were also, these were all comments from the 2010 census, I believe. And so I think it'll be important for us to talk about what is the intent versus the impact of each of these statements, especially with what we talked about with tonality, right? With some of these statements, you know, it's, you don't look Jewish. And the way that you could say that could come across very different way, have a very different intent and impact. He is Christian, but very open-minded. It's great you don't have any accent. Your hair is so nice. I didn't know it could be like that. I thought it was a wig. How can I help you? Oh, you're here for the SCA event, which could be, oh, you're here for the SCA event. I never would have guessed you were gay. You have a lot of energy for an old guy. If you want to research your heritage, you could portray a slave. And so I won't stop sharing here, but I would love to hear if there's any comments about thoughts in terms of what might be the intent versus the impact of each of these statements. And so, Zara, feel free, or anybody just feel free to unmute. We can go for it.
So I will jump in because obviously I've talked about these before. So I think with some of them, they're meant to be complementary, right? So the intent is 100% positive. So if you take something like he is Christian but very open-minded, you're trying to reassure someone that whoever you're talking about is open-minded, and you're trying to kind of make them more comfortable with the person. But the implication here is that to be Christian is to be inherently not open-minded, which is hugely problematic, right? So you don't want to imply that about people. So the impact of it could potentially be very negative. Why do you feel the need to make this implication here? So I think with a lot of microaggressions, it's difficult because the intent was some kind of positive thing, some kind of compliment, some type of positive statement, and the impact ends up being incredibly negative because it plays to problematic rhetoric or stereotypes.
Well said.
So I have, a couple of things. So I've been working this DEI movement, so to speak, before everything got really haywire in the world. And one of the things that we really had to unpack was when you say something, you're coming from a very basic cognitive mindset of, like, when you're a baby, you say that has 4 legs, so it must be an animal. That has 2 legs, so it must be a person. And it's really not that we're trying to attack what you think, but we're trying to unpack what you think, because, like, he's a Christian. So now in my head, my experience is that Christians are only this way, right? But he's very open-minded. So that can be anything. So how we learned who a Christian was, for one example, is different than what we need to understand now, right? And it's not that our cognitive processes are bad. They're working the way they should, because that's how we learn. We put things in a box. But whenever we're digging through these, we need to take it out of the box and say, now, when I grew up, I had people that I came up in a church that was very strict. So that's my mindset. We need to unpack that mindset and then relate it to, oh, okay, he's a very open-minded person. and that's all that you need to say. But that's what we've been talking about in my work, is that, you know, your biases are very unconscious because your cognitive brain works that way. So I don't know, that's just something I thought was interesting.
That's fantastic. And I think I'm gonna like steal that a little bit from you. Like we're unpacking, not attacking. I loved that.
So I had an interesting, I apologize. Did you want
to? Sure, thank you. So some of the things that you've mentioned here, I never realized them as microaggressions. So I am a non-native English speaker. I'm an immigrant. So it's weird to me that, and I understand where it's coming from, but it's still weird to me when somebody says, that, for example, oh, you don't have any accent, and oh, you speak really good English. I always found that weird because that was one thing that I absolutely, like, I personally always took that as a compliment, because I heard that a lot when I came here, and I still hear that now. So I guess, like, for me, it is a struggle because I'm like, yeah, I want to speak good English. You know, I want to speak well. So I guess those are like things that I am trying to, like, I don't know, maybe it's something like I've been conditioned to not see that, but I guess it's a thing that I am personally still struggling with. So if you have any suggestions on how to, you know, like how to overcome that, besides just like reminding myself, well, no, that's not something you should be proud of. I still take it as a compliment whenever I hear it was said to me. So.
Well, and don't get me wrong, like, you don't have to be offended if you're not offended. Like, okay. Yeah, like it's these could be microaggressions and offensive to some, you know, and if you don't find it, like, if you take it as a compliment, awesome. Like, that is fantastic. I want you to be able to do that. So there's not like a prescriptive, like, these are the wrong things to say, these are the right things to say. Everybody is different. And like we talked about before with those filters. And so for you, I think that's fantastic that you're like, I take that as a compliment. It's not a microaggression to me.
Hi, this is Cassandra.
Hi.
So I had an interesting experience last year. Now, just to give some context, I work for an international organization. I travel both around the country as well as into Canada with clients. So last year I went to a client for workshops in Salt Lake City. And one of my coworkers amongst the workshop, and we talk about reading the room, and he had mentioned one of our other coworkers who wasn't at that workshop was Mormon, and just clicking in my mind, my interactions with this other coworker over there, I kind of just said the first thing on my mind, I go, well, that makes sense. And I didn't read the room, but as he read the room, everybody kind of like, you know, that tense moment. What they didn't know, and of course it's not appropriate to share in that moment, was as a young teenager, one of my closest friends was Mormon. And I went to the services and the youth activities with her, and his composure reminded me so much of the adults that I interacted with that time. And that's why the connection made sense once it was said. So, you know, I had the private conversation after the workshop with my management. I said, I apologize. It was not my intent. And it made me more mindful of when I'm in these workshops to listen better, to, you know, be silent at times when I need to be silent. And it ended up not being an issue, but it very much in this case where you said he is a Christian, I associated and said, oh, it made sense. not the open-mindedness or anything else, but that little connection had taken my clients aback. And the other thing I wanted to comment on was about the accent. You don't have an accent. Everybody has an accent. And when we don't think we have an accent, is a lot to do with our localization, where we don't move about because we're used to hearing the same voices, and also through the Hollywood movie and television industry, where they have picked to emphasize particular accents that seem to be most understandable by the largest portion of speakers.
I'm very appreciative of what you've shared for a couple of reasons. One, I live in Salt Lake.
Okay.
So, like the fact that you brought that up, it was just like, oh yeah, it's very much to home, very close to home. And yeah, I think you bring up with both things that you bring up, location and where you're at and the cultural norms could be very different. And so you might say something unknowingly that might be very taboo in a certain area, right? And so even that, that misunderstanding that can occur can be exacerbated if you're in a different culture. If that makes sense.
Oh yes, I moved from West Kingdom, San Francisco Bay Area, to Northeast Pennsylvania in late 2004, and all I knew about the SCA, except for a couple of trips outside my Northern California for SCA events, was all about that. And they talked about the Western tradition versus the Eastern tradition, which were significant. But over the years, I played in enough groups to realize there is no single SCA group that's unique in thinking it's unique.
Yeah. Thank you for your comments. I very much appreciate them. It looks like we have a hand raised.
Yes, we have a hand raised, and then we have a few more comments to read. So I'm going to try to go into the order. So Elizabeth said in chat to the microaggressions discussion, I think people find microaggressions hard to discuss because they tend to bring out unconscious biases, and some people don't really hear those unconscious biases as they speak. I think that's a great point. I want to tack on, because these are all kind of divorced of context, it can be really hard to figure out like, well, maybe this isn't something that I would find problematic. I know that I personally have gotten the, it's great you don't have any accent comment, which is problematic because it followed me saying something about being Puerto Rican or being Afro-Latina. And I don't in fact speak any other language. So there are some assumptions that are being put on me when those comments get made. And so I think it's really about context. And certainly, please don't think that you have to find these comments offensive. But there are people who might. And so people should be mindful of the context in which they deliver things. So we have another comment. It's nuance 2 from Cynthia Lee. One might not find it negative, but the person saying or doing certain things may really be expressing a microaggression, whether they know it or not. Both can be true, which is totally accurate. And then Sabine, do you think that you can share the slides as kind of handouts for people afterwards? Would that be okay?
Yeah, how might I go about doing that?
If you get like a Google Doc link to me, I can go ahead and just put it on the event page if that works for everyone.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so that'll be the slides for Cynthia and then Karen. So it'll be the slides in the form of a handout because you don't have a separate handout for this. I think it's just the slides.
Yeah, and I could put it into a PDF or something and send it your way too. So
yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
And then Elizabeth Anderson has her hand up for a comment or question.
Oh, yes. I was just going to comment on, so for example, I I can see the oh, you don't have, or like your English is really good. I see it from three sides, especially with my family being an immigrant family. I was born in the United States, so I've had people tell me, oh, where did you learn how to speak English? You speak English really well. And I'm like, well, I learned how to speak English where you learned how to speak English. But then my mom is still learning how to speak English and taking English classes. So if somebody were to say, oh, your English is really good, she would take that as a compliment. Versus my dad, who has been, you know, studying English for a really long time and has a very good grasp on it, still has a strong accent. If someone were to say, oh, your English is really good, he may find that offensive because he's been studying, or it'll sound to him, it might be hurtful because he's been studying English so long and trying to you know, show that he's speaking English really well. So it's like there's lots of different nuances and different ways. I think really it's know your audience before you say something. Like if you know what their background is, making a comment after, like if you're trying to give them a compliment, like if somebody found out that I guess my best example is when I moved to Idaho, I moved there from New Jersey, and within my first week of class, I was sent to an ESL class. And there was no, like, nobody had consulted me or my parents. I just got sent there, and then I had to go through the cards and discuss, what's this card? It's a waitress. What's this card? That's a table. What's this card? That's a door. And by the end of it, they were like, why are you here? And that was one of those things of that implicit bias of, I moved there, I look Asian, I must not speak English.
Those are great examples. I'm very appreciative that you brought them to us. And I love what you said in terms of try to know your audience. And again, none of us are perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. And so it's just being able to have a better understanding of where somebody is coming from when that occurs.
Okay. Katie has a question that she's going to ask from the Facebook.
Cool.
Yeah, so we have a question on Facebook that came up, and I think we may have started addressing this earlier in the presentation, but here's the question. This may have been mentioned before. How much responsibility is on the individual to not become offended at perceived offenses? Are there ways to check ourselves so as to not become offended?
That's a great question. I think we always are responsible for our actions and our reactions. And while we may not be able to immediately control our initial response to something, we may not immediately be able to control that we're hurt or we're angry, right? We can control what we do with that. And so I think it's okay to be hurt. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be sad, right? Those are all valid emotions. It's what we choose to do with that we have a responsibility for. And so if we choose to lash out, we are responsible for that action. If we choose to ask the question of, hey, that landed on me weird. Is that what you intended, right? We have that responsibility to decide what to do with our hurt feelings. And some people may choose to just like brush it off, not deal with it, and that's okay. And that's our choice. I hope that helped answer the question.
Yeah, I think that was a great question. We have a couple of comments that I'll read. So Elizabeth says, my brother, who was adopted from South Korea at 4 months old, gets the accent comment. He's like, duh, I have only ever spoken English. And then Rosa, I'm sorry. I guess I have always thought some comments are rather irrelevant. Like, why even mention how well someone speaks unless they ask you first? Similarly, I don't ever comment on someone's appearance unless asked for input. And then Annette followed up that last question from Facebook. While some people are able to let things roll off their backs, some are not. It also depends on the people involved and a myriad of factors. My fencing shirt says, yes, I hit like a girl, now take it like a man, which can be offensive in and of itself. And then I just want to add, I think that was a fantastic answer when you talk about we can't control our emotional responses, but we can control how those responses manifest. But that said, I do think that these classes are helping us not only learn better tools for responding in effective ways and having those productive conversations, but also getting a feel for where pitfalls might be so that the careless comments become fewer, because we are more mindful of what we're putting out into the world and how we're potentially affecting people. So I think it's both things, right? Learning how to respond in a more productive way, but also learning how to put things into the world that are less likely to be misconstrued.
Now it looks like we have a raised hand as well.
Cynthia, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Good, I didn't double mute myself. Okay, I do that far too often. Well, it made me think of the question about a background. I'm a union steward. I get involved with things like that, and I often stand up for people. And I'm white, even though my kids are only half white. They're half white, half Chinese. But oftentimes people don't stand up for themselves because their voices have not been allowed. And so I personally feel, I mean, you have to judge every situation, but I personally really feel strongly that you need to stand up for people, or at least for the right thing in circumstances, to correct things like microaggressions, simply because people's voices may have been robbed from them, or other people may simply not know just how badly they're transgressing. They might not notice because it's the cultural thing around them that people have this horrified, hurt expression on their face that they quickly hide and then move on. And I was wondering, you know, when we're looking at that intent versus impact and the discussion so far, from what I've heard since I managed to finally get here, I was wondering what your input or what your commentary would be on that.
So that's a great question. And I gotta say, there's a part of my background that I think, and I'll own this, I think provides a little bit of a bias here. In that I think advocating for people is important, especially those that whose voices have been disenfranchised. And at the same time, I think if we keep advocating for them while also not empowering them to use their voice, we continue to disenfranchise their voice. We have to find the balance between supporting them so that their voice can be heard and not enabling them or rescuing them so that they continue to not be heard. You know, that's kind of my take on that question. I don't know if that helped answer that.
Well, I mean, that's part of it to me, but the other part is, you know, taking the person who is committing the microaggression aside and saying, do you realize that blah, 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 and not singling out the person who they may have been aggressive towards, but just pointing out that, you know, we can do better. There are things you need to be mindful of.
Yeah, I think that is fantastic, you know, and you could say, hey, I'm just a friend here, want to put this out there, and not say, and I think it's also important that if the other person isn't offended, you could pull them aside and say, hey, this person wasn't offended, but this other person might be, I don't know, just throwing this out there that it could be an offensive statement. Could be a great way to help somebody build their own awareness around what they're saying. I think it's important, though, that we not get offended for other people, especially if they're not offended themselves.
Okay, and we've got Another comment from Elizabeth. Use your privilege to help create opportunities of empowerment. Become a great ally, not an accidentally oppressive advocate. Yes, yes, so much yes. That and what you just said, you don't want to tell other people how they feel about things. You want to give them the platform to be able to speak for themselves, for sure.
I've loved the discussion so far, and I also want to be mindful of time. So thank you so much for the comments and the questions, and we'll just keep moving through. We've got a few more slides left. We'll just keep moving through, and if we go a little bit over, feel free to stick with me as long as you want, and if you need to bug out at 7, I also totally understand. All right, so coming back. So there's some more SCA specific examples that I wanted to discuss that might help provide intent versus impact. We've already talked about a lot of these in the last slide, but these are a few more. So when somebody says the words helium hand, the intent is identifying someone who volunteers frequently, but the impact could be derogatory, shame people for volunteering, and potentially do the shame others feel for not volunteering as well. It's just important to look at, some people may find that offensive and some people might like that, right? Same with the good old days, especially now online, we're seeing that statement quite a bit, like, oh, we just want to go back to the good old days. And I think the intent around it is nostalgic. It's reminiscent on good times for certain people. However, the impact is that depending on who you are and how you're reminiscing, it could harken back to more oppressive times that may be hurtful to others. This was provided to me, which I thought was a super interesting example, giving belts, especially belts for laurel or pelicans. You know, the intent for any sort of belt is showing that that individual is on the path. However, the impact is that maybe with those in non-fighting tracks, some get viewed as look at me, leading to mixed messages. This is an interesting one as well with the award culture within the SCA. The SCA has very much an award culture as part of it. It's a big part of what keeps us going, and I'm not going to like hark on that at all. I think there's some benefits to it as well. The intent is to recognize individuals for contribution to the SCA. However, the impact is that some might feel entitled or covet certain awards rather than aspiring to them. And then I have a personal SCA example that kind of happened recently. You know, and again, I had to think of this presentation quite a bit. So recently I posted on my Kingdom like unofficial Facebook page the screenshot, and you can see it on Google. It's the paradox of tolerance. And on that, it's the message is, you know, the paradox of tolerance is when we tolerate everything, we actually then become intolerant of like, I'm trying to figure out the best way to phrase it because it's leaving me right now. But if we tolerate everything, then we tend to we become exclusionary of those who are disenfranchised. And so I posted an infographic on my Facebook page, and that infographic had a swastika on it. And the message of the infographic was a good message. However, the swastika on it, and I didn't even like think about this, but it was absolutely offensive, right? It had a big impact. And so it was one of those moments where it was brought to my attention. And it was like, oh, okay, yes, I've got to take this down. I've got to fix this. I've got to repair this. And that's what I did, is took it down. I apologized. I said, I in no way endorsed this. And I had to recognize my own stuff that was coming up in that regard, because my intent was to educate. It was to help others understand what the paradox of tolerance is. And the impact came across as though maybe I was supporting Nazi propaganda, which I wasn't. And so recognizing, like, in that moment, justifying, you know, my intent didn't matter, right? I had to acknowledge the impact that I had. So yeah, there's a very vulnerable example for me as well. And we've talked about some other examples. Feel free to put them in the chat. We can talk about them a little bit at the end. I want to make sure we get through a couple more of these slides though. So what can we do? So some great conversations are occurring regarding considering the impact of certain messages. For example, there's some conversation happening right now about finding titles instead of master or mistress because of what that could imply. The speaker's biggest mistake is sanitizing the impact with the intent, invalidating the impact due to misaligned intent. Meaning, well, I didn't mean that, so it's not that big of a deal. And it can be very much a big deal. The listener's biggest mistake is assigning the speaker's intent, because when we do that, it's difficult to listen openly when we hold on to preconceived notions. So it's important that we develop empathy for ourselves, for other people, and we admit when we make a mistake and we have a wrongdoing. We apologize earnestly and we take accountability. We make reparations when possible. We increase our listening skills. We show openness and curiosity towards self and others, and we challenge our internal defensiveness. And I'm going to play this video, which will hopefully help really sum up everything we talked about.
Hey, are you awake? I know how hard it can be. Sometimes just getting out of bed is a hassle.
There we go.
Race, the final frontier. No matter what channel you watch, no matter what feed you aggregate, it seems like everybody everywhere is talking about race right now. And when everybody everywhere is talking about race, that means sooner or later you're gonna have to tell somebody that they said something that sounded racist. So you need to be ready and have a plan in place for how to approach the inevitable "that sounded racist" conversation. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The most important thing that you've got to do is remember the difference between the "what they did" conversation and the "what they are" conversation. Those are two totally different conversations, and you need to make sure that you pick the right one. The "what they did" conversation focuses strictly on the person's words and actions and explaining why what they did and what they said was unacceptable. This is also known as the "that thing you said was racist" conversation, and that's the conversation that you want to have. The "what they are" conversation, on the other hand, takes things one step further and uses what they did and what they said to draw conclusions about what kind of person they are. This is also known as the "I think you are a racist" conversation. This is the conversation you don't want to have, because that conversation takes us away from the facts of what they did and the speculation about their motives and intentions, and those are things you can only guess at, you can't ever prove, and that makes it way too easy for them to derail your whole argument. And that is the part that's crucial to understand. When you say, "I think he's a racist," that's not a bad move because you might be wrong. That's a bad move because you might be right. Because if that dude really is racist, you want to make sure you hold him accountable and don't let him off easy. And even though intuitively it feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, "I think your ass is racist," when you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy, because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of. Just think about how this plays out every time a politician or a celebrity gets caught out there. It always starts out as a "what they did" conversation, but as soon as the celebrity and their defenders get on camera, they start doing judo flips and switching it into a "what they are" conversation. "I have known this person for years, and I know for a fact that they are not a racist, and how dare you claim to know what's inside their soul just because they made one little joke about watermelon tap dancing and going back to Africa." And then you try and explain that we don't need to see inside their soul to know that they shouldn't have said all that about the watermelon, and you try to focus on the facts of the situation, but by then it's too late, because the "what they are" conversation is a rhetorical Bermuda Triangle where everything drowns in a sea of empty posturing until somebody just blames it all on hip-hop and we forget the whole thing ever happened. Don't let this happen to you. When somebody picks my pocket, I'm not going to be chasing him down so I can figure out whether he feels like he's a thief deep down in his heart. I'm going to be chasing him down so I can get my wallet back. I don't care what he is, but I need to hold him accountable for what he did. And that's how we need to approach these conversations about race. Treat them like they took your wallet and focus on the part that matters, holding each person accountable for the impact of their words and actions. I don't care what you are. I care about what you did.
All right. So, got to figure out how I get back now to my PowerPoint. That's how I do it. Okay. So, hopefully that helped answer that. We've got, I think, one more slide and then we'll come to more of a discussion here. But just helpful hints that weren't included in that video, because I love that video. I think it sums up things very nicely. True listening occurs when you listen to understand rather than listening to respond. and noticing that response of, I just want to say something in response rather than really taking in what the other person said. You know, a couple examples is, oh, wow, I didn't mean to come out that way, and I can totally see how you took it that way. I'm sorry, I'll do better. Or, I'm really sorry for hurting you. Can you help me understand what was hurtful so I can do better in the future? The first one is like when you can totally see it and you're like, I'm sorry, let me validate that. The second one is when you don't get how that was offensive, ask like, hey, can you help me understand what was hurtful so I don't do that? Not the, I'm sorry that you're upset by my words, but that's not what I meant. Anything followed after a but, like anything before a but, is invalidating. And so I would say steer clear of the buts. And I like this part of this sentence too, which is, I'm sorry your face got in the way of my frisbee, but I wasn't throwing it at you. It's a subtle difference, but key. Apologize without caveats. All right, so let's come back to our wrapping up discussion here. I think there's a lot more in the chat, so Zara, take it away.
We are totally scheduled for 2 hours. We will hang out as long as you are available. Slash, I can stay and answer any kind of more general questions at the end. I want to start with the Facebook questions this time. So I'm going to let Katie read any questions or comments that we've gotten through the Facebook Live, and then we'll come back to the Zoom and we'll go through those.
Okay.
All right, so yeah, we've got several comments throughout, and they've kind of been building here and there. So I'm going to go ahead and read those and try and watch to pause. So there can be conversation as it makes sense with that. So I have here, one of the comments is, the issue is if others take offense on behalf of one another being a concern. I think somebody also mentioned that silence is so powerful, and I think we kind of talked about that a little bit, but the thing about that is it's so double-sided yes, it's powerful. Silence is deadening, but from both perspectives, and especially from the individual who has been impacted.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was a really interesting and an important thing to note. Assumptions are deadly, which should be a shirt. I would like to point out that to me, the point of these particular lessons seems to be how to minimize our own offense, not so much finding a bias. Thoughts on that one? All right, rocking on. All right.
Well, and I'm thinking about that. Sorry.
Yeah, no.
I think they're linked, and that's why I'm pausing, because I think usually when we offend somebody, it can come across because of an unconscious bias. Not always, but they're there. So that I think for me, I'm a little confused because I think to me they're a bit linked.
I think that what he meant was middle ground, finding a middle ground versus bias. Let's see, we did have a comment where the individual said, it's hard to imagine a microaggression against Christians in our culture, which I think is an interesting insight that came out. So any thoughts on that?
I mean, I
If
would
I could-
say, oh, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. So, you know, I feel like if someone said, oh, you're a Christian, I've had that happen to me. You know what I mean? Actually, really funny old story, and what it ended up with, this guy said, oh, you're one of those people who goes to church, right? And it was just the tone, the delivery, everything was showing a complete bias. So I do think it happens. I think that we have a perception that Christians are the majority, but that doesn't mean that they don't feel that unconscious bias come out to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do think it's fair to say that biases can definitely be built in among all groups, right? Bias is just kind of something that we internalize. And sometimes people internalize bias against in-groups that they're a part of, right? If you grew up in a household that had behaviors that you didn't care for associated with some aspect of it, you may carry that negativity with you throughout your life. I think personally, the example that we gave earlier of he's a Christian but very open-minded is absolutely an example of a microaggression. Even though, yes, we do perceive Christians as the minority or the majority, I'm sorry. It is very problematic to then make assumptions about everyone based on that. And if you've got a group like the SCA, where we generally don't bring religion into the game itself outside of the historical study that we do, and so we don't have a lot of hierarchy with regards to religion in the SCA. So yeah, I can definitely see how that comment coming out of the blue at an event, or if someone threw that comment out in a group of mixed company or to a newcomer, you really don't know how that comment's gonna hit. You have no idea what your impact might be. So that's definitely something that I would be cautious about, for sure. But Kate, I'll let you go through the other comments too.
Sure. There was also a kind of example about, I think, in response to the microaggression against Christians that came up. It was not intended as an aggression, but I probably offended people when I asked, can we acknowledge that religion is a choice? It was intended to put in perspective that you choose religion and where to spend your time versus race or ability, that you have no choice and will actually impact access. I only have the best intent to make clear perception, but am also very direct and logical, so have to work on tempering that always. So that's something that was brought up, and then a response to that, which was interesting, which is tangentially, but religion is not always a choice. People are often pressed into their religion by familial ties, further complicated by economic factors. Any thoughts on that? Because that was an interesting conversation back and forth. Sweet deal. I want to make sure to clarify that what I'd read earlier, the point was to minimize our offense towards others, not to find a middle ground between being offended and offending. So just to clarify that from earlier, that was that individual's clarity. Just sorry.
Yeah. That makes sense. So it's, yeah, I think it's that we don't want to offend other people, and if we do, finding that middle ground of what to do about it.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Then I think when they were talking about being a supporter for groups, there was a consistent messaging here online, which is nice to see, is an advocate can become an aggressor. And empowering and supporting is a good way to go. And I think that runs the gamut of the comments that I have so far. It looks like there's one other person who has commented that says Jews are both a religion and a race of people. And so that's what we have from online right now. So thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
Okay. And then anyone who wants to kind of respond, or if they want to let some of the comments sit for a minute and percolate, because there's definitely things that I'm like, yeah, but I can't off the top of my head right now. So I'm gonna take a sec and ruminate and come back. So I'm gonna go back to the Zoom chat and read through there. So people spoke about how helium hand really ruffles their feathers. We talked, I know it was on the slide, the paradox of tolerance, but Karen pointed out, if we tolerate everything, we tolerate intolerance. And then also regarding awards, people can get hours of what about me instead of celebrating others' achievements, so they can become disenfranchised by that. And then more on the helium hand, Cynthia asked, I'm not sure, is helium hand a slur used against people? I haven't heard this before. So I want to pause. There's more to read, but I want to pause there because I have definitely heard helium hand kind of being the, you're volunteering all of the time, which can potentially be you taking opportunities from other people, but can also be you filling needs that are going unfilled. And something that I think we talk about a lot in service circles in the SCA is the idea of over-promising and under-delivering. So if you commit to something, you've now committed to it. And as difficult as it may be to fulfill that commitment, if you've taken on concurrent commitments, you still have committed. And so you either need to be very good about communicating that to people, letting people know, you know, hey, I did this. I said I could do this. I don't know. I might need help. This is where I'm falling down. This is what I need from you, or this is what I need to give up. And if you do that early enough, you may be able to avoid a lot of the negative repercussions. But generally speaking, my first mentor in the SCA always drilled it in, the don't overpromise and underdeliver. It is better to just say no at the outset than to take on too much and then not be able to give people what you said you would. So I want to finish that comment. Belts, wouldn't this impact also be a fighting channels versions of belts too? I'd lump them together. And for awards, I've seen and felt that unless you've got the time, money and time to devote your whole life to SCA contributions and volunteering, that you won't get recognized for what you do, not in a covet or aspiration, but rather the demotivating side of things. Cynthia's got her hand up, so I'm gonna let her maybe speak to that a little bit more. Cynthia, go ahead.
Actually, my hand up was about a different point.
Okay, can I keep reading comments and I'll get back to you?
But for that particular thing, I've seen that in various areas of the SCA online and in person, and I've seen people basically become a wallflower just doing the one thing that they do. And I think that's really unfortunate because it shouldn't be about awards. It should be about people sharing their passions.
No, I agree. I agree completely.
You want me to hold my question though?
Yeah, let me know when it comes, if it's related to one of your comments coming up.
No, it was related to the comments about religion.
Okay, then we will pause there.
Okay.
Okay. Kathy says, depersonalize the conversation. Annette, returning to the helium hand, has pointed out that it's inferring that one is piling too much on one's plate.
Can I add to that? Really
yes.
Yes. Because, and this is like a big soapbox for me. I think it is so important that we practice teaching, learning, practicing, having more boundaries in the SCA, because I think we get rewarded for not having boundaries. And so it is, I think, very important to be able to, like you said earlier, know what you can commit to. And especially in times like these, like it's when our cups are a little bit dry or something like that, it can be really important to recognize what we can give versus trying to meet everybody else's needs from an empty cup.
On the helium hand conversation, Elizabeth said, I've been told I have helium hand plenty of times. I hate it. The people who tell me I have helium hand are certainly willing to partake in the activities I plan. It feels a lot like denigrating the people who do the service we all need to make things run. And then a question. There's a difficulty too when one tries to not assign intent and approaches a lack of clarity with questions that get shut down because of the other party's interpretation of your intent. How do you handle those situations?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. There's a difficulty too when one tries to not assign intent and approaches a lack of clarity with questions that then get shut down because of the other party's interpretation of your intent. How do you handle those situations?
Okay, so it becomes a circular, I've been impacted by what you're saying kind of conversation.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, if you're recognizing that, you know, it's hard to talk to a brick wall, right? And so it's one of those things where you can say, hey, look, I want to have a conversation about this. It seems like we're both struggling right now with being able to have a conversation about this. Maybe we can come back to this later, because this relationship, this conversation is important to me, and I want to make sure that we are able to hear each other out.
Okay, and then we've got, everyone loved the video, and many people have asked you for the link. So if that handout gets distributed, it will be on there. So I will put that in the event as soon as it's over, basically. And then we are, I think, on to the questions regarding the religion. So Cynthia, do you want me to read this, or do you want to just go ahead and kind of restate things in your own words?
Well, actually, my comment was in response to the Facebook live streaming.
Sure.
I just wanted to point out that the SCA, is essentially a worldwide organization, rather than just being in the States where Christianity is assumed to be the majority religion. And there are places in the world where not only is this not the case, but being a Christian can not only risk your life, it can hold back every aspect of your career, your access to various other things. I mean, you move to another place and all the dynamics of privilege shift. And we have to remember that that is something that for people coming into the States, or people who are from elsewhere, or people who are located doing SE activities elsewhere, would not be approaching it from a USA-centric situation. And it's really important to me to remember that kind of thing too, because we can't assume that, it's always the Christians who are the majority. It's always the white people that are in the majority. But yeah, I mean, I've seen people who say are not Christian who basically will occasionally also go in my comment on the chat, will also go back, and you can see it crossing their face that, hey, they slam my religion. Maybe they're Wiccan or pagan, or maybe they're Muslim or something like that. I'm gonna let it go, because we get it all the time. They never get anything against them. I mean, I've seen people do that, and to me, that's really important, to try to work to better oneself, to still not commit those microaggressions, even if you are in that place. It's like taking the higher ground, making that choice every time.
Okay, we do have a couple more hands up as well. So Cassandra, go ahead, and then Kathy.
Hi, I wanted to go back to the helium hand comment. And I made a comment that it ruffles my feathers. Where I have seen this is the interpretation by many people is you're volunteering without thought. And that can be very detrimental to people. I think any time that you volunteer to do something, it should be with thought, that you have the means to be put in a position where people are observing you volunteering to the detriment of your personal well-being is a disservice. And that's, why I say it ruffles my feathers. I want people to be thoughtful when they volunteer.
And then Sabine, of course, you can jump in whenever, whenever you want to give feedback. But Kathy, go ahead if Sabine doesn't have any response right now.
Okay. So one of the things that I have tried to be very careful about is, I feel like there's a lot that became misinterpreted in an environment where you're not talking to someone, or you don't have the flavor of the conversation or the emotion there. So, I mean, I'm very careful not to post things where, somebody might jump down my throat about it, because I don't want to have this argument online about where my feelings have come from and how to dig myself out of them. I think that's online is a hard place to have that middle ground found, right? Because people aren't, we're not accountable for what we're saying because we're saying it to a box rather than to a person. And I think that is a downfall of having the internet in communications and public, and there's various websites. So I don't even put it up there because I feel like if I put it up there, somebody's going to be offended, and then somebody's going to say, well, I don't respect that you said that. But at the same time, I'm respecting them for responding. So I just think it's a bad environment to do that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it likens me to driving on the road, right? Like I will get road rage at people and flip them off, and then the minute I make eye contact with them, it's like, oh, there's a human there. It's not just a robot driving the car, right? It's kind of the same thing. Like there is a lot that can get lost online, and so I think it is beneficial if what we post online is thoughtful, and we will make mistakes. I did as well. And but yeah, I think being able to be thoughtful about what we post is important.
I actually love that like you compared it to the road, because I do this like constant stream of consciousness when I'm driving of like, okay, Toyota, we're just gonna go 10 below the speed limit. That's totally cool. There's no reason for it, but here's where we are and here's what we're doing. And then yeah, like I literally refer to them as Toyota or whatever the make of their car is, because it is so divorced, right? I get to put that distance between myself and the other person. And I don't know, there could be someone in that car that's like, I just spilled hot coffee on my lap, buddy. Like I'm doing my best, but I don't care about that. All I care about is that we're going, well, it's Chicago. So I guess going the speed limit is not good enough, but yeah, no, I like that you compared it there, because we do have that little bit of distance that lets us divorce empathy from what we're doing, which is potentially really problematic. I've got Elizabeth's hand up, and then I've got a couple comments that I'll read.
I actually think, can people hear me? Hello? Good, okay. I actually think that the helium hand discussion is probably a better illustration of intent versus intent and impact than we probably realize, because people are giving all the justifications for why helium hand is used. But I've had it used on me, I don't know, more times than I can count. And you may mean, hey, don't put too much on your plate. But what I hear is, I don't appreciate what you're doing. Because I don't think you can handle what you've taken on. I'm used to being underestimated. I am a short, chubby woman who looks probably about 10 years younger than she is. And I get treated that way in all aspects of my life. I get underestimated and told, I don't think you can do that. I'm going through it right now looking for a real job. So it's one of those phrases that I'm like, you may mean something, but for somebody who does the service I've done, what I hear from people is, I don't really appreciate what you do. So it's one of those phrases I'm like, you may mean well. And if you really are concerned, I'd rather you have a conversation, but helium hand just feels to me like, yeah, there you go, doing that again. And if I'm falling down on the job, talk to me, but just calling it a helium hand because I volunteered again, it feels really denigrating.
I'm really grateful you shared that. I think it takes a lot of courage to say, this is the impact this is having on me, to a bunch of different people. And so I'm very grateful that you showed that bravery and let us know, because yeah, it's the reason that it's in the presentation, because it is very big with intent versus impact. So thank you.
And a follow-up question to that, do people who have had helium hand used against them feel like their efforts are considered worthless? I know personally, I don't have it used against me a lot. People throw it out as jokes a lot. I tend to do a lot of things And I get a lot of the like, couldn't help yourself. And I'm like, no, I thought about this and I felt like it was important. I'd be interested if other people want to weigh in on that, because certainly it can feel very dismissive.
Can I follow right on? I probably I wasn't as offended when I started 19 years ago as I am now hearing it over and over again after I feel like I've kind of proven myself, and I do a lot of mentoring of other people, and I feel like I share the toys, and it feels like it gets really old, I guess would be the way to put it. It feels like I'm being mocked way more than I'm being appreciated.
I've got Maeve and then Atesh. Did I say that right? Maeve?
Okay, sorry, I answered and I didn't realize I was still muted. I saw several comments about different groups being in majority or minority, and the makeups, the conversation about makeups of groups changing in different places. I think it's also important to not just look at the numbers of people, but also look at privilege and whether or not that still attaches. For example, I grew up in a town where I was a racial minority. My high school, the majority of the students were Black. But I mean, I still had a lot of privilege. So just because I was technically a minority as far as demographics, I was still I can't claim that I have been oppressed in any way because of that. I mean, I think it's important to not just look at, well, this group has a majority group in this area and this group is a minority group in this area, but also look at, how does that impact you? Does it just mean you might be occasionally uncomfortable? Or does it have how severe is the impact is what I'm saying. That also is relevant to the discussion and not just numbers.
Okay, right before Atesh, I do want to clarify one quick thing with Katie. We've got some questions about like what helium hand actually is. So Katie, I'm gonna let you hop in on that one and then we'll go to Atesh.
Yeah, so I just had a question of just reiterating what helium hand was in reference to the discussion prior to what we've talked about so far. If Sabine would be willing to reiterate what she had on that slide.
Absolutely. So, I could go back to it. It might take a little bit of time. So we're talking about helium hand being used as an intent versus impact kind of thing. So when somebody says, oh, they have helium hand, it refers to somebody who can't put their hand down from volunteering from something, right? That's kind of the literal meaning of it. The intent of it could be, they just like to volunteer. They're volunteering for a lot of things, right? And it could also have, depending on who's saying it, possibly some different intent, right? They might be worried for the other person, concerned for the other person, jealous of the other person, right? But we don't know. We can't assume intent. That's just sort of the basic, that's what it kind of means and represents. Right now we're talking about the impact that it has had on a lot of people because it is used quite frequently.
Okay, Atesh?
So a perspective on people using the whole helium hand commentary is I've held a lot of offices. I have concurrently held a bunch of offices at the same time. And I have had people make comments about helium hand. I like paperwork. I find it relaxing, which is weird, but it amuses me and I find it relaxing. But I also listen to people around me, and I have heard really? You're going to do another office? Like, You want to do the office? Well, no. Or, well, you've held that office for a long time. I can't find anybody else to take over for it. Do you want to be a deputy? Do you want it? Oh, hell no. And in the politest level, it is not endearing. And it does also, it kind of hurts the feelings. Because it's like, would you rather have this not be done or not exist? Like when I was webmaster, would you rather we did not have a website at all rather than me take care of it? Like, please come be a deputy, please take the office. Oh no, I just want to kind of mock you off in the corner, and it's like, it's demotivating and it's hurtful. So it's like, I don't know, like I know when people are joking about it and they're just joking. It's like, okay, that's fine. But there's a lot with that helium ham bit where it's like the whole like frenemy type thing, like where people are, oh, I'm just kidding, but I'm really not. And it's kind of harsh.
I'll be eating Nashville hot tofu tacos from Velvet Taco. Thank you. Oh, I wasn't ready.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it sounds like in a way it could be even used as a backhanded compliment, kind of what I heard you say. And I think that's a great point. Like, if you're going to say somebody has helium hand, then you also have to be willing to step up and do the job too, if you're criticizing them for volunteering to do the job.
Okay, we do have a couple more comments. I'm gonna finish the helium hand discussion, and then I'm gonna jump back up to a previous discussion. But Genevieve was saying that she had seen it used as a self-identifier, not something she'd use to someone. Possible that those self-identifying have let others think that they can use it towards service mavens. So yeah, I think that does happen, right? You hear people kind of using language for themselves, and so you start to use it in reference to them, but that's not always okay. A lot of modern day parallels there. Yes, it was, Jermaine says it was used, at first it was used towards me as a joke that became held against me. So I think we've all kind of come to the realization through the discussion that it can be problematic. I do want to jump up, way up. So we will have a longer conversation about awards because Katie's going to pull together some conversation from the Facebook Live. So we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, to the subject of religion, a comment and then a question. So the comment is, I think it's important to acknowledge religion in the context of how it would influence the lives of the people we're learning about. Not sure that someone's actual personal life religion is a necessary part of SCA play. And then the question is it a microaggression for someone to keep mentioning their god/gods they follow in their real life? Should we not have any mention of religion/gods in SCA contexts apart from research?
So my thought is it's okay to talk about your own beliefs, and, as long as it's not hurting or marginalizing anybody else. You can talk about the gods you believe in or things like that. To me, I think it's when we start assuming other people or putting caveats on other people or their religions or things like that. I think that's where it gets a little sticky.
Yeah, and then the SCA, of course, has rules around what religious things are allowed to be kind of officially brought into the organization. So certainly, I think there are avenues that are totally okay and avenues that are very much less okay. There's more information about that in governing documents and stuff like that, though. It tends to be outside of anything we're talking about here. It tends to be more like non things that you can't opt out of in terms of religious ceremonies and whatnot. Okay, so we've got another comment, nothing wrong in wanting to strive for excellence in service. And then Kathy says, the bottom line is you bring who you are to an organization. My hope is that I continue to learn, grow, and gain emotional intelligence through my interaction with those in the society. And I think that's very well stated. And then a question, is it possible to get a bunch of examples of how to change microaggressive statements to a neutral statement? So I'm going to jump in really quick before Sabine, if that's okay. So often it depends on where the statement is coming from. If the statement is a manifestation of your bias, it doesn't really need to be said. So if you meet me and I tell you that I'm Afro-Latina and you assume that I speak Spanish and want to compliment me on my English because of it, that's usually something that's coming out of bias, right? You've made assumptions about my background and my education potentially. And so it's not a necessary thing. It's very difficult to deliver some comments in a way that isn't microaggressive because they're resting so heavily on biases or stereotypes that we don't really know that we're holding. But there are definitely ways to say like, oh, I love how you said that, right? Or saying like, oh, I never understood that concept before and you explained it beautifully. So getting at the meat of what you mean kind of without that bias overlaying it can be very challenging. It's called unconscious bias for a reason, and it takes some unpacking to really understand where that's coming from. Sabine, if you want to add on to that, please go ahead.
I really liked what you said, and I think in teasing out some of the examples that were on the presentation, I look at observe and describe. It's a skill that I like to teach at work, and it's observing and describing non-judgmentally. And biases kind of could have some judgment to them, right? And so you could say to somebody, he's a Christian. That's observing and describing. He's a Christian, right? Or he's very open-minded, right? And that's part of your experience with him. I think when you combine the two together, that's where it can become a lot more loaded, right? And so I think it can be important to look at, all right, I'm saying these things. Do I have a judgment around it? Do I have a bias around it? Can I observe and describe this just sort of factually, right? And I think if you stay with those, it will definitely help when you're engaging in these kinds of conversations, or really generally any kind of conversation as well.
Yeah, and there is a larger conversation about this in the 101 where we talk about this more thoroughly. So if people are interested, Sabine teaches that, I teach that, a few other people teach it. There's video up on this page, I believe, and it'll be taught again. So email equity@sca.org. I can make sure that you get the invite next time that goes up, or just keep an eye on the SCA Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion page. That's where we post everything. That's where this Facebook Live is. Speaking of, I'm going to throw things to Katie so that she can talk a little bit more about what's going on in the comments on the live.
All right, happy to be back. Just wanted to touch base. One of the discussions that was going online is when we had discussed award culture. And there was a disagreement there that award-based achievement is super important to some people and should be is a totally valid way to play it. The discussion went into the consideration of not saying lording over of awards of other people, and considerations then for people who felt as if they were unjustly or did not receive awards if they had done similar merit type activities that went to that direction, and then led to deeper considerations of, did it have more of a nefarious edge to it? Was it because of politics of the time? Is it because of other factors like race or religion or gender or sexuality? that didn't happen. The discussion then moved to a consideration then, is that more of something that then goes on the very consideration of the awards that are given, and that what goes into giving those awards, and understanding the populace a little bit better as far as that goes. So it was a pretty arced conversation to kind of go through having two separate perspectives and the possible harm and good of the awards, and that impact and intent, mirroring what we've been talking about in today's class.
Yeah,
So,
it's very nuanced.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's complicated. I think almost that's its own full discussion, right?
Right.
Because we look at awards, and of course the intent of awards is positive. For those of us in the Middle Kingdom, at least, I know that the phrase "only good things happen in court" gets thrown out a lot when it comes to being called up directly, because people get very nervous. But if you're receiving an award, the intent is positive. But that's the intent kind of towards that individual. And it looks like we're kind of looking at the broader implications or impact for the people around that individual, everyone else. So I think that that's a really complex topic. I wouldn't even know where to start addressing that. The way that awards are done is so complex, in that you recommend people for awards, and then it goes to your crown, who ultimately makes decisions about those awards. They may consult other people. They may be talking to friends, their peerage orders, different people in the orders of the awards, or different recipients of that award, barons and baronesses. I mean, it's a lot, right? So it's difficult, I think, when you're feeling emotionally about something, to not want to prescribe some kind of negative intent to your lack of an award. But I would highly encourage people, if at all possible, which I know is very difficult, it's very hard to put that space in between it and just understand that so many different factors go into whether you receive an award or not, but so many of them are out of your control, right? So certainly, if you suspect it is because of your being part of a marginalized group, that's something that's a huge problem and needs to be discussed. You should report that. But if it is something where you're just feeling slighted, you're feeling sad because someone got something when you did not, I would say talking to mentors is a good idea. Putting some space in between yourself and the thing happening and looking at it from a more critical lens, the visibility of your work. There's a lot of different factors that can have us have that kind of emotional response. But I do want to encourage people to not let that emotional response dictate your immediate action, because it is so complex and there are so many factors at work.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That was beautiful.
Okay, I think do I have more? I know some people who desire the awards because they're looking for acceptance within the society. One thing that is in your control is your own journey of excellence. That I agree, 100%. That is what you have the power over, yourself and how you act. And again, I do want to underscore, should there be problematic things happening, please do report that, reach out, get in contact with your seneschal. It is absolutely not okay for you to be lacking in awards because you are part of a marginalized group. That is not something that I'm going to say like, well, you just need to sit with it. Like, no, you don't. That's not okay. That's not who we are as a society. But absolutely looking into more of the complexities here, talking to people who might have more experience. It could be that the work that you're doing is just not visible. It could be that the work that you're doing, or the art that you're doing, or the fighting that you're doing, you just need to talk to people who can help you get it into the right competitions or tourneys or what have you. Award recommendations are something that some groups are much better about than others, and that's kind of the initial for a lot of awards. So making sure that you've got those award recs in. Oh, and Elizabeth just said, I strongly encourage people to understand the award recommendation process in their kingdom. Any interest of you, know what the basic process is for peerage discussions in your kingdom, because it varies. I have heard so many myths about peerage meetings before I was a peer. Yes, there are a lot of peerage roundtables. You should seek them out. You should look at them. You should find out what the process is. It is different in different places. Absolutely seek that out. And, you know, talk to people. Peers are leaders in the society who are willing to help you. So going to someone and saying, hey, I have these doubts, I have these fears, I want to talk more about this. Can we talk about this? Is much better than just kind of stewing in it by yourself and allowing that hurt to percolate. Okay. Sabine, Katie?
Can I jump in on that?
Yes.
Okay, so I fully agree 100% with what Jessica's saying. And nobody wants anyone to feel ostracized or unappreciated in the SCA, certainly. I can speak from my own small example and advantage to being able to make or hand out awards when I was on the throne in the mid-realm, and a lot goes into those decisions. But award recommendations are key. You may know many of those people, but you also may never have met these people. And all you can go on are the words of others and what you can nefariously ferret out from those that you might know that know them, or, you know, look for them on Facebook and things of that nature. Not to throw away secrets here, but so a lot of times, just to reiterate, there is so much that goes on and goes into those, and every person who, from at least a royal peer standpoint, has had that to make that decision, they've kind of got their own insight and perspective that also goes into that, because none of us are without bias or our own interests, and sometimes that does flavor things too. So just as a side.
And I think what I would say is that the awards culture is a big pillar of our society, and it's something I personally love. I love watching people get awards. It's part of the reasons I love like serving behind the thrones, because it's fun to watch people's faces when they get awards. And so I completely agree with that part, is if you do feel marginalized, say something, speak out about that. And if there's a reason that you feel overlooked, then seek counsel. You know, like Zara said earlier, take some space and maybe check your own filters of potential entitlement or anything like that that might be coming up.
I do also want, I've got a couple comments that I'll read. I've got a hand up. As we continue to talk about awards, I do want to remind people, you are not your awards. You are you. You can do anything regardless of where your awards are. You can take any job. You can behave as peer-like as you want to be. You do not need to be recognized formally to live the peer-like qualities for the job that you're hoping to someday get. I think for many of us, of course, I think a lot of people, of course, you want to be a knight, right? You come into the society and you see this, you want to be that, and you want to be that leader. But I just want to remind you, you don't need the piece of paper. You don't need the token. You can be the person who you wanted to be then. You can be that person now. I am not a peer. I do not even have a grant level award. It has not stopped me from doing the things that I felt were best for the society. So please, please don't let yourself get trapped in the, I can't do this until I have this. It's not true. You can do it. So the comments, don't assume that someone has an award. Check. Same with recommendations. Don't think, well, I'm sure someone else has recommended them. I don't need to. If you've seen good done, let folks know. Yes, absolutely. Elizabeth responded to say yes. I was in a group where everyone was bemoaning no one having an AOA. Then we had a class on awards and how they worked, and we figured out that no one was writing any recommendations. Yeah, award recommendations. I can't tell you how many people I've heard kind of offhandedly mention that they didn't have one thing or another, and everyone else around them is like, what? I had no idea. Like, what? I just assumed. Check your OPs. If you have wikis, check those. Don't assume that people have things. Atash, your hand was up. Did you want to say a little bit more on that, or?
Yeah, I was just going to give an example, which was we had a girl that she was the essential, and we were at an event, and somebody in our group got an AOA, and she made just a little offhand comment about she didn't have one. And we didn't realize that even though she'd been in the group for 10 years, where everybody thought there was one event where a block of people all got their AOA at the same time, we never realized that she had joined into that block of people. It was a dance troupe, so we got the AOA for service for everybody running demos and gate and everything. We didn't realize that she had come in right afterwards. So since she was always with everybody and it had been so long, we just thought she got her AOA with everybody else until she made this comment like 10 years later. And we're like, oh dear. And then it was where not just one person, like, oh, here, I'll put the recommendation. It was a block of people all got together and here, this is what she's done. And they all filled out their own recommendations to point out that we messed up. We didn't realize she had it, and she had more than earned getting an AOA. And it's like, oh darn. So that's where it was definitely don't assume, go and check, and not just go, okay, I nominate you to put in this recommendation. If you see somebody that has done something cool, make sure other people know about it so that they can get the recommendation, or not recommendation. Oh, my brain quit. I'm sorry. Recognition that they deserve to get. Because even just a simple, you're awesome, can completely make somebody's day.
Yes, and piggybacking off of that, sometimes certain service, certain arts, these things are invisible. People don't know about them. So if you see this, take it on yourself to write in the person, let other people know, write their Baron and Baroness, write the Crown, write whoever. It doesn't even necessarily have to be an award rec, but just let other people know, because you may have seen work that would otherwise go unrecognized. So we are going to wrap up in the next 5 minutes. So I am going to go through, we have one more question that I'm going to ask. And then if anyone else has any further questions, I'll have Sabine do a quick wrap up and she can give you her contact info. And then I'll mention mine. So the last question for us tonight is, how do you see intent and impact from working to save space for others, and how that impacts both how you project your own intent and what impact you may have?
Okay. Sorry, I'm just reading it and digesting it. How do you see the intent and impact from working to save space for others, and how that impacts both how you project your own intent and what impact you may have? I would say things like this is definitely a good start, like attending classes that help you better understand and practice self-inquiry. And we can save space for others. They may or may not take it, right? And so all we can do is practice what we can do. So I don't know, I guess I'm trying to like figure out how to answer that question, because it's a big one. And I don't know if there's, let's see who wrote it. Cynthia, I don't know if there's maybe more explanation around that question, but yeah, it's a big one, so I'm trying to figure out how to answer it.
Well, I wear a lot of hats in different areas, and the idea of being thoughtful in your approach and saving space for others, the idea of allyship, the idea of backburnering yourself a bit to make sure others are heard and they get their needs met, those kind of things all seem to pair together to me. And it really, I was just wondering if there's anything that you really feel or see that does impact this discussion on intent and impact, or if it really ends up being more of a separate discussion that is kind of so broad or so deep that can't really be covered here.
Yeah, I think that would probably be more of a separate discussion in terms of how we practice saving space. I think it's a great concept, and I wish we had more time to do it justice. Because yeah, I think that's something we can definitely put on the docket to, you know, just like the awards culture, address separately, because it's being thoughtful about how to save space for others is important.
Well, for me, I think you actually kind of answered my question with that. It was sort of in a nutshell thing about we can make space for others. We can do the best we can, but it's up to them how they interpret it, how they take it.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for the question.
Okay, Sabine, do you want to do a quick wrap up at all, and then I'll wrap up?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I just want to say thank you all for attending, for watching. I did not anticipate that this would go the full 2 hours, and I'm thrilled that it has, that there was such great discussion around and such great questions. I hope, you know, that you walked away, or you walk away, or you come away from today with, you know, a better understanding of intent versus impact. I will definitely get the PDF to Zara so she can share it to the page, and so that everybody has the slides from today. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on Facebook, Sabine Crespelle. I'm Talisha mundanely, you know, weird names. And I'm the DEI officer for Artemisia as well, and so you can contact me that way. The email is quite lengthy, so I don't know if I want to say it over Zoom, but I could type it into the chat, or I could type, or sorry, you could type it in when you send out the link too. That could work.
Yep, can do.
Okay. But thank you so much for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your night.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Handout will be posted to the event, and we have these classes every Wednesday night. So Sabine will be back. Mostly because I'm dragging her back. But thank you again, everyone.